A friend invites you to a celebration where a ritual involves slaughtering an animal in the backyard, while your partner insists this act is cruel and unacceptable in your city. Your neighbor says the ritual honors ancestors and builds community, and your partner says the ritual normalizes suffering and ignores the animal's pain. You both stand there, plate in hand, and wonder who is right when different cultures give different answers to the same moral question. Is morality a set of timeless truths that apply everywhere, or can it exist without absolutes, guided by compassion and respect amid difference? The question matters because our lives are braided together with people who do not share our codes. Our apps connect strangers across continents, and our daily choices travel through complex systems we barely see. If morality must be absolute, we fear becoming rigid and judgmental. Yet if it is entirely relative, we fear dissolving into anything-goes complacency. Between those fears lies the search for a way to be principled without arrogance, and open without drifting. Think of three voices that often guide our moral conversations, because each speaks a different language about what makes an action right. One voice appeals to reason and consistency, asking whether your choice could be defended to anyone who can think clearly. Another voice looks to consequences, asking who will be hurt and who will be helped, and whether suffering will rise or fall because of what you do. A third voice focuses on dignity, asking whether you are treating people as ends in themselves rather than as tools for some purpose. The first voice echoes an ancient conversation that Plato helped to start, where real moral truths were imagined like stable forms that do not bend just because opinions change. Plato's spirit invites us to think beyond fashion and fad, to ask if justice or courage or honesty have a shape that can guide us even when our tribe disagrees. This voice can be bracing when crowds demand cruelty, and it can be comforting when a lonely conscience stands against a city's applause. The second voice grows louder in modern life, where we can measure consequences in data and stories, counting hospital beds spared or children lifted from hunger by specific laws or simple choices. This consequentialist spirit says the point of morality is to reduce unnecessary harm and expand well-being, which turns ethical reflection into a practical craft of forecasting and feedback. You see this in public health decisions and everyday kindness, because small acts add up like droplets filling a bucket, and the level we raise is the life we all share. The third voice speaks with calm gravity about respecting persons, sounding very much like Immanuel Kant's insistence that people are never mere means, even to noble ends. Kant's idea can feel strict because it asks us to check whether our actions could be universal rules, and whether they honor the inviolable worth each person carries. This voice protects the vulnerable when efficiency tempts us to cut corners, and it reminds us that progress without respect is simply a faster road to the wrong destination. Now let's return to the backyard dilemma and place these voices around the table, because they will not agree immediately, and that is exactly the point. Reason asks whether the practice could be justified to any rational agent without contradiction, and whether we would accept it as a rule if we were on the receiving end of its harms. Consequences ask whether the ritual increases suffering compared with available alternatives, and whether there are ways to preserve meaning while reducing pain. Dignity asks whether the people involved are being respected as autonomous agents, and whether any being's capacity to suffer is being dismissed as unimportant. Relativism enters here with an invitation to humility, reminding us that across history and geography, people have lived well under different norms that made sense in their contexts. Modern relativists often point out that moral claims are embedded in language, power, and tradition, so we should beware of imposing our local preferences on a world that does not share them. Relativism can protect diversity and prevent moral imperialism, which is no small benefit in a century of intense migration, technological change, and cultural encounter. Yet relativism can also disguise indifference, because if right and wrong collapse into nothing but taste, the oppressed lose a language for complaint, and the powerful learn easy excuses. People worry that without absolutes, society crumbles into cynicism, where everything is negotiable for the right price. But this fear describes a moral vacuum, rather than a nuanced alternative. Between rigid dogma and vapid anything goes, lies a disciplined pluralism where we test reasons, compare outcomes, and honor dignity while building common ground through practice. Practice matters because shared habits can stabilize moral life even when high theories differ, like traffic rules that vary by country but aim at the same reduction of harm. Consider how the world learned from medical tragedies and shaped new norms, because after atrocities in wartime experiments, the global community codified informed consent and research ethics. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not descend from the sky intact, but emerged from debate, compromise, and a sense that certain violations are intolerable anywhere. Consensus can grow like a reef, layer by layer, as communities discover what protects the vulnerable and sustains trust across difference. This is not relativism surrendering to chaos, but fallible people converging on better rules, while keeping room to revise those rules when new voices are heard. To practice this approach, imagine 3 simple tests you can actually use, because moral philosophy should travel with you to the grocery store and the group chat. First, ask the universalization question by picturing your action as a rule everyone follows. Then notice whether that world could function without contradiction or hidden privilege. Next, ask the suffering question by estimating whose pain increases or decreases because of your choice, using available evidence rather than wishful thinking. Finally, ask the dignity question by checking whether you are treating people as ends with agency, consent, and respect, rather than as instruments for your plans. These tests do not guarantee saintliness, but they make your reasoning transparent and your care visible, which is how trust grows between people who disagree. Let's use a concrete story to see the tests at work, because abstract talk shines only when grounded in real decisions. A nurse discovers that a popular local coach has a serious communicable disease and refuses treatment, while the community adores him and his team's future depends on his leadership. Universalization asks whether keeping confidentiality while ignoring foreseeable harm could be a rule we would accept if we were the ones at risk from exposure. Consequences ask whether disclosure to limited authorities would reduce harm more than it harms privacy, and whether alternatives like anonymous contact tracing can protect both values. Dignity asks whether the coach is being treated as a person with agency rather than a problem, and whether those at risk are treated as people rather than statistics to be managed. Now imagine a different case, because morality becomes clearer when you compare stories that pull in opposite directions. A young woman wants to marry against her family's wishes, and her parents come from a culture where marriages are arranged to weave families into larger networks of support. Universalization asks whether forcing marriages to preserve tradition could be justified as a rule if everyone's freedom were at stake, including your own or your child's. Consequences ask whether coerced consent has predictable harms in mental health, autonomy, and social stability that outweigh the benefits of family cohesion. Dignity asks whether both the woman and her family are being treated as ends, which includes listening to fears, honoring bonds, and protecting the right to choose one's partner. In each case, the tests do not deliver a mechanical answer, but they direct attention to the right pressures and the people affected, which is the soul of responsible judgment. Some worry that without absolute answers we will paralyze ourselves with analysis, but good practice builds muscle memory for the moral life like drills build skill for a musician. Codes of conduct in professions evolve through cases and reflection, and individuals can do the same by keeping a small journal of choices and lessons rather than waiting for the perfect theory. When we make mistakes, and we will, we can repair harms and update rules, which is accountability in action rather than shame frozen in time. Critics say that appealing to outcomes can justify cruelty if the numbers promise greater good, and they are right to warn that arithmetic can flatten human worth. This is exactly why the dignity test stands guard, insisting that some lines should not be crossed even for bright goals, because a person is never a tool. Other critics say that dignity talk without attention to real-world effects can become sentimental, but that is why the suffering test keeps our compassion tethered to measurable consequences. Still others complain that universalization can be gamed by imagining narrow rules, but public reasoning exposes those tricks and forces us to articulate principles that others can share. You might ask where Plato stands in this mix, and the answer is that his hunger for stable truth reminds us that some values deserve our allegiance, even when they cost us. Honesty, fairness, and courage are not just local flavors, because any community that discards them pays a price in chaos and distrust, which is a practical way to glimpse their universality. Yet we should avoid pretending that every custom rides on a universal, because humility helps us distinguish between moral bedrock and cultural furniture. The fear of moral collapse without absolutes loses strength when we see how institutions, shared narratives, and lived commitments create durable patterns that outlast any single disagreement. We do not need unanimity to have stability, because consistent practices can hold us while debates continue. Much like sports have different strategies but the same rules and respect. Language helps too, because having common words for consent, coercion, harm, and dignity allows people to negotiate across difference without slipping into silence or shouting. Psychology adds another layer, because humans carry biases that bend our sense of fairness toward our own group and our own stories, unless we deliberately widen our circle. Practical tools like seeking disconfirming evidence, inviting diverse perspectives, and naming the person who will bear the cost of our choices help stretch our moral imagination. We can also rehearse difficult conversations before we face them, practicing how to articulate our 3 tests without accusation, so that the other person feels respected rather than cornered. History offers hope that moral learning is possible, because movements against slavery, for expanded rights, and for protections of children did not rely on a single argument, but on a chorus of reason, compassion, and dignity. None of those shifts were clean or quick, and none were perfect. But over time, the circle of concern widened, which is a clue that progress happens when we braid the three voices together. Technology gives us new dilemmas that demand the same braid, because artificial intelligence, surveillance, and gene editing force us to ask again what can be universalized, what reduces suffering, and what honors dignity. When platforms amplify outrage to harvest attention, we can universalize a rule of honesty in sharing, measure the harm of misinformation, and protect the dignity of those turned into targets. When workplaces monitor every keystroke in pursuit of productivity, we can ask whether the benefits outweigh the erosion of trust, and whether people are treated as partners rather than components. When environmental choices pit jobs against ecosystems, we can examine realistic transitions that care for livelihoods, while honoring the dignity of future generations who will inherit our decisions. If you feel overwhelmed, remember that moral clarity often starts with small promises kept, because micro-integrity scales up through networks of relationships like seeds becoming forests. You do not need to solve every debate to practice kindness with backbone, and you do not need omniscience to seek better evidence before you act. Use the three tests like lenses you rotate, checking the scene first for consistency, then for suffering, then for dignity, and back again until the picture sharpens enough to move. Beware of two common mistakes that derail otherwise good intentions, because catching them early saves regret later. The first is confusing certainty with courage, since courage often includes acknowledging uncertainty while stepping forward with care. The second is confusing empathy with capitulation, since real empathy listens deeply but still names harms clearly and protects boundaries firmly. Sometimes you will meet someone who says everything is relative, and at that point you can gently ask whether their statement is absolutely true or only locally true for them. The self-contradiction is an invitation to explore how even relativists rely on shared norms like honesty in conversation and fairness in turn-taking, which means some common ground already exists. At other times, you will meet someone who insists that every moral truth is obvious and settled, and there you can invite a tour through history where certainty fueled injustice. Acknowledging tragic mistakes does not make you cynical, because it trains you to hold convictions with humility and to test them in the open where light and disagreement can refine them. Let's return to your life this week and pick a simple decision you actually face, because philosophy earns its keep when it helps on Tuesday afternoon. You might be deciding whether to call out a colleague for taking credit, and you can universalize a rule about honest attribution before predicting the fallout in team morale and personal risk. You can then check dignity by planning a conversation that preserves the colleague's face while being truthful, using language that seeks repair rather than scoring points. Or perhaps you are choosing how to explain a family boundary to relatives who see your new rule as rebellion, and you can universalize a rule about consent before estimating harms and crafting respect. In each case, the point is not to perform moral calculus with perfect accuracy, but to move from impulse to intention and from habit to reflective practice. A helpful mental model is to treat morality like carrying both a compass and a map, because each tool does a different job, and both are necessary in unfamiliar terrain. The compass represents firm principles like honesty, non-maleficence, and respect for persons, which keep you oriented when fog and crowd pressure pull you sideways. The map represents local knowledge, consequences, and cultural nuance, which help you choose a path that actually gets you there without unnecessary harm. If you throw away the compass, you will wander according to convenience, and if you throw away the map, you will crash against cliffs you did not see coming. Learning to read both together takes patience, conversation, and practice. Yet the payoff is a moral life that avoids rigidity without falling into drift. When you talk with people from other backgrounds, remember to put your compass on the table first, naming the values you will not betray. Then unfold the map together to find routes you can share. Ask what rule you would want to live under if roles were reversed. Ask who is likely to bleed or heal because of your plan. And ask how dignity speaks for each person involved. Name where your knowledge is weak and promise to update it, because accountability is a virtue that thrives in the open rather than in secret. Celebrate small agreements because they are the threads of trust, and honor honest disagreement because it is the oxygen of learning rather than a failure of friendship. Protect the courage to say no when a clear line must be drawn, and protect the courage to say maybe when your first certainty turns out to be a hasty guess. Remember that judgment without kindness becomes cruelty, and kindness without judgment becomes complicity, while the marriage of both is what grows character. There is no final algorithm for being good, but there are better habits for staying oriented, improving your maps, and traveling with people rather than trampling them. So when another backyard dilemma arrives with mixed invitations and urgent feelings, you will not panic. because you have tools to slow down, to ask better questions, and to act with care. What practices could your community adopt that would make the compassionate choice easier next time? And what principles do you need to defend even if they cost you comfort? Where must your compass refuse to budge because dignity is at stake? And where should your map remind you that humility and learning are wiser than certainty? If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Carry a compass of human dignity and a map of compassionate consequences, because with both in your pocket, you can travel far without losing your way.